Hello everyone, by now you've probably seen the newest lock and load dual speedrun with the first ever record to go under 3 minutes. Here I will do a breakdown of the speedrun, analyzing all the routing decisions we made to push the time this low. First, a brief overview of the lock capturing mechanics. You know that you need at least one unit from each player near the lock to progress the capture timer. The capture boundary is pretty easy to see. It is simply this circle around each lock. The center of the unit selection circle has to be within this boundary, and it is okay for part of the unit's model to be outside. The capture timer takes 30 seconds to fill, but it can be paused if an ally steps away from the area or if one of Amon's units enters the area. If both players step away, or if an Amon unit enters the area while only one ally is present, the timer resets. If any single unit from either player enters the area, enemy units defending that particular lock will move into the capture area to prevent capture, which is a feature added a long time ago to address the old cheese from Raynor and Artanis. The two main principles behind lock and load speedruns are reaching the locks themselves and then defending the locks. The first one is a mobility issue, and it should be clear that Abathur has no problem with this thanks to his deep tunnel. The second principle was the part that needed heavy optimization. The main limitation to the speedrun is basically how many locks you can cap at once. Solo speedruns mostly work on one lock at a time since it's difficult to have a split army powerful enough to hit multiple locations. Sometimes you can be fast enough to clear another lock before the previous one has finished capturing, but you're still moving your forces from one lock to the next in a sequential order. For the longest time, we thought that even in a duo run, the best we could do is assault two locations at once. The reason is that the back two locks are heavily defended, and this left side lock is particularly dangerous due to the swarm hosts, whose locust high DPS will shred through brutalists. Normally, you would need at least two brutalists to safely clear the swarm hosts and to properly tank the back locks. This consideration is why we ultimately decided to use Dehaka's first prestige instead of the third. The third prestige has the advantage in that you basically have two Dehakas to deep tunnel to the back locks, while also allowing for easy elimination of the big hybrids. But that only solves part of the problem of the lock defenders, and it does not solve the issue of the swarm host lock. Meanwhile, Dehaka's first prestige allows brutalists to gain buffs based on what Dehaka devours. In particular, the hybrid dominator at the upper right lock gives buffs based on its massive and psionic tags. The massive buff provides 3 armor and damage reduction, both of which will negate the danger of swarm hosts. The psionic buff reduces the cooldown of symbiotes, returning them to their pre-nerf machine gun speeds, but with the Masteries double damage. With these buffs, it became possible to defend all 3 difficult locks simultaneously. The big disadvantage was that the lack of a twin Dehaka meant that we had 2 locks requiring dangerous drone migration across hostile territory, but that was solved with very good timing on when to send them over. Now to go through the opening. The main limitation to this run is how fast we can get brutalists out. I don't want to build a spore crawler to lure since it costs precious 75 minerals plus mining time for that drone. I don't want to build an overlord for supply, which is why you see me build extractors and also kill a drone to free up supply. This is the absolute fastest I can get 3 roaches out, give or take a second or two. Here you might think maybe P3 Dehaka would be superior since he can lure from 2 locations at once. But as you can see, even with 1 Dehaka luring, I simply cannot produce roaches fast enough to keep up with biomass generation. Rushing 3 brutalists is limited by economy rather than biomass. Another thing you might notice is that instead of going directly to the second luring area, we cleared this mini camp here and then send a roach on a roundabout route to collect from there, even though the bottom right lock has easier, more direct biomass. This delays the second brutalist, but it allows for the third brutalist to be faster due to the third roach not having to walk so much to pick up the biomass. The third brutalist is the first time limitation, since that controls when we can start capturing the locks, so it makes sense to sacrifice the second brutalist timing for the third. Oh, and before we forget, the masteries for Abathur are fairly standard for speedrunning. The first set is tailored specifically for Zerg, with enough toxic nest damage to 2-shot aberrations, while putting the rest into Mend. The second set is pretty obvious for an ultimate-oriented run, and the third set puts 1 point into nest charges, so the 6th one starts arming right from the start, while the rest go into structure morph so the Roach Warren finishes faster. Abathur also uses a 2nd prestige for stronger locusts, which should help with stalling at the final locks, and the downside of the increased gas cost is completely a non-issue. For Dehaka's Masteries, we go for the Devour buff duration for the first set due to our reliance on the Devour buff. The second set is entirely irrelevant, and the third set is pretty obvious considering Dehaka makes no army. Once all 3 Brutalists are out, the next big decision is the Devour buff and how to split the Brutalist. One consideration we made was waiting for all 3 Brutalists so that all 3 can be buffed. However, this means we truly are tied to the timing of the 3rd Brutalist for the triple lock capture, and we actually don't need all 3 to be buffed. Since eating the Hybrid Dominator essentially nukes a lot of the defenders at this lock, the Brutalist in charge of this lock does not need the Devour buff. The Swarm Host lock most definitely needs it to safely clear the defenders there, and you can see that even with the buff, it gets quite low in health. The Far lock technically doesn't need a buff Brutalist to safely cap it thanks to Dehaka's presence, but here the limitation becomes a rush of enemies including the big hybrid. Having the Devour buff means we can more quickly clear the enemies who would otherwise interfere with lock capping. We had the time to wait for the 2nd Brutalist anyways before moving to get the buff, since we were still waiting on the 3rd Brutalist to morph. With the Devour buff, we are now ready to capture the locks. Unfortunately, it is physically impossible to send the 3 Brutalists to their locations at the exact same time. I had to deep tunnel them one at a time to each of the 3 locks, and the choice of what lock order to follow was also carefully considered, even though it seems very insignificant. The obvious last choice is the upper right lock, since we just significantly weakened it, so there won't be much resistance. Then the real decision is whether to hit the Swarm Host lock first, or the upper left lock first. I think the absolute most optimal order is to send the Brutalist to the upper left lock as the first choice, allowing it to start capping it half a second early. The Swarm Host lock has to wait for the drones to reach there, so sending a Brutalist half a second early wouldn't have mattered as much. And as you probably know already, the upper left lock was the final lock to finish, and was the limiting factor. I made a choice to tunnel to the Swarm Host lock before the upper left despite this, for safety reasons. The Swarm Host lock is extremely inconsistent due to the strange burrowing behavior of the Swarm Host when the lock is triggered. It was often the limiting factor due to this inconsistency, and since I knew we would get under 3 minutes despite the half-second delay, I decided to go for the slightly safer deep tunnel order. I did get quite the miraculous positioning at the Swarm Host lock, where the Brutalist was body blocking some of the Swarm Hosts from moving in, while drawing aggro away from the lock capture area, allowing the lock to be captured uninterrupted. This spot right in between the infestation pit and spawning pool is a perfect sweet spot for this purpose, and I was actually very surprised I managed to tunnel so close to it through the minimap. I'm not going to bother embellishing my skill. This run had an almost perfect Swarm Host lock by sheer luck, a blind Hail Mary deep tunnel. Luck, like in most of the optimized speedruns, is actually a huge factor in this run, which really stretches our attention thin. You can see that on Dehaka's end, the main difficulty lies in exactly when to send in the drones. Too early and they die, too late and we lose time. This requires a lot of experience and finger crossing to get right, since the timing depends on my Brutalist and is never the same each game. On Abathur's end, the difficulty lies in getting the 3 Brutalists to be in the proper spot in a quick order, especially at the upper left lock where proper body blocking is key, otherwise too many units slip by to pause the capture timer. I have to trust that my Dehaka partner will then do the rest, while I focus on the other 2 locks to make sure nothing is going wrong there. You can even see that Abathur's Locust spawning RNG came into play at the very end when they stopped this Ultralisk from getting into the lock area. I cannot emphasize enough how tight the triple lock capturing is, requiring blindingly fast decisions and positioning that simply cannot be consistently replicated. We just have to commit to our actions and pray that RNG goes in our favor. And there you have it, the magic sub 3 lock and load run. Very special thanks to my partner Cassical, who is our dedicated Dehaka speedrunner. We also want to give special thanks to Almighty Eddie as well for his divine blessing that gave us the resolve to complete this feat. It's actually quite amazing how much depth there is in such a short speedrun. So until next time, thank you for watching.